Hello, welcome to Walk Warriors. It's a provisional title, which we've got some misgivings about. So if you've got some suggestions about what we could call the show, let us know in the comments below. We were discussing on what we should talk about this week, and we had loads of different ideas, but we've kind of crystallised around the idea of talking about Keir Starmer and his leadership of the Labour Party. And one reason for that is it's trending on Twitter. There's at the moment hashtag Starmer out is trending. And the other reason, I guess, is that Joe and I have been discussing this for a very long time. And just to give you a bit of background, I've been much more positive about Starmer, or at least I've had a kind of let's wait and see approach to his leadership of the party. My position has been, and there's a suggestion there that it might have changed, but my position has been that we should wait and see, and that we're too far off an election. And the other thing I would say is that I've been, it's difficult to argue against Starmer in the context of the polls going well. So I've always sort of, I'll put it on the screen, Labour's poll rating from the time he got elected up until more recently has been going up. And so I sort of looked at the graph and gone, well, things seem to be going okay. Why are people attacking him? And I have changed my mind a little bit since then. But Joe's been much more sceptical, and we've argued about this consistently. And I guess I'm moving towards his position as I normally do. So do you want to say a little bit about why you've been a bit more sceptical?
Sure. So I was initially someone who, I would say with Starmer, to be honest, I just accepted the inevitability that he was going to emerge as Labour leader. So in a sense, it didn't seem to matter really whether or not you supported him or not. It was clear that the consensus view was that Starmer would be able to present a kind of a more politically acceptable face to what I think were actually some quite popular economic policies that have been offered by the Labour Party sort of between 2015 and 2019. So there was a view that the leadership wasn't particularly popular. So if you had a more credible leader offering a similar range of policies, you'd be able to really galvanise support for Labour. I was sort of willing to give, therefore, Starmer the benefit of the doubt over the course of the spring and the summer. But the one thing was crucial in my view. If Starmer was going to win, he would have to be able to unite the left of British politics. Now, obviously, there's always going to be an element of the left that are not going to be rally to Labour. But I also think there's a kind of a larger pool of people who are just, and I'm thinking particularly here, younger people, people who are just actually generally quite turned off politics. They don't get excited about politics particularly. The kind of people who, we did see backing the Labour Party in 2017, in big enough numbers for the party to poll 40%, which I think, the simplest thing I can say about that is it's very rare for a party to poll 40% in British politics. It only happens, sometimes no party polls that high. So there's, only a relatively small number of times over the course of, say, the last 30 years or so where that's happened. So there is a real value in uniting the left, whilst also, of course, winning over voters in what you might, you might call the centre ground, winning over some ex-Tory voters or some voters who'd strayed to the Tories in the last election. So that seemed to be plausible until Starmer seemed to take a policy of actually attacking the left within the Labour Party as a means, I think, of winning credibility from, broadsheet newspaper editors and, mainstream political commentators who took what I see as a very lazy view of the left, which essentially it's there just to be sort of like beaten down by a leader like Starmer in the way that Kinnock did in the 1980s. And I feel like his tactics were wrong. His strategy was wrong. And as soon as I saw that, I lost faith in him, because the reason I backed Starmer wasn't because I thought he was great in terms of his politics or particularly his personality, but I thought this is a guy who understands strategy. He knows that he's got to unite the left in the way that Boris Johnson united the right in the 2019 election to earn such a massive majority, or an unexpectedly large majority in 2019. So for me, like I'd say the USP for Starmer, strategy, looking ahead to a future election 2024, he's not fulfilling that. You mentioned polling. There's no question Labour's polling is much improved over the course of this year. I genuinely would question the view that this would have been achieved. This is, an achievement of Starmer. For me, the government is in utter disarray. Okay, things have rallied a little bit more recently. The good vaccine news has really helped, but this has been dire for the government. Watching ministers being regularly torn apart by Piers Morgan on Good Morning TV, and hugely damaging stories about its handling of the coronavirus crisis. So my view is that sort of more or less any Labour leader would be polling in the high 30s against such an obviously failing Conservative government. So I don't think there's any mileage now in pushing this idea of a kind of a miraculous recovery under Starmer. And I would like to know what the plan is, because at the moment it's not at all clear to me. If it's winning over centre ground voters at the expense of kind of trying to inspire a political movement on the left, trying to inspire left activists to go out and campaign, I just don't think it's a strategy that has mileage, and I'm happy to unpack that over the course of the next.
I think probably if you ask them, they would say that the strategy is to win over people who voted Conservative last time. That's the strategy. But I think that strategy is really difficult because I think that our politics is increasingly defined by a major culture war that Starmer is doing something really weird about. I mean, you've got this sort of constant banging the sort of nationalist drum in a really sort of weak and not very plausible way. And so I remember just before coming on air, there was a tweet where he said, we're all with you, Captain Tom, you're a national hero. There's the sort of writing in the Daily Mail. He's desperate to talk about the troops at every possible opportunity. So this sort of attempt to situate himself, at least in performative ways, on the right of this culture war, in an attempt to, I guess in an attempt to neutralize that issue for the Labour Party. But that sort of relies on the assumption that this culture war is something that can be neutralized in British politics. My view is that it's absolutely central to why Boris Johnson won. It's absolutely central to solving one of the major puzzles in British politics, which is why on earth, despite everything that happens, are the Conservative Party on 40% of the polls, right? And the only way you can solve that riddle is to come up with a plausible narrative about why it is that people continue to vote for a government that are so catastrophically incompetent. You've got to come up with. So the way that I've resolved that is to think about the culture war. So what is it that is leading people to support Boris Johnson? Well, I think it's because Johnson represents almost in human form a particular conceptualization of Britain, who we are. And this is why Captain Tom's actually quite important, I think, in this narrative. If you think about who Captain Tom is, he represents a British Tommy in World War II. That was World War I, wasn't it, Tommy's? He's a British soldier in World War II, right? So he's a sort of last link to an almost forgotten British past, where in our imagination of who we are, Britain is, the greatest empire in the world. We're fighting the good fight against the Nazis. We're definitely the good guys. And so we can be, in a very unproblematic way, because that's important. It's a whitewashed version of history. In a very unproblematic way, we can be proud of being British. And it's that particular conception of history that is at stake in the culture war, which is why, the Churchill statue, being daubed with graffiti about the fact that, Winston Churchill was a racist. That's not a controversial thing to say, right? So I mean, it is a controversial thing to say in Britain, right? But it's not, if you've got any sort of respect for evidence or facts, it's not a controversial thing to say. He was a racist. If you want me to justify that, I can. I'm not going to get into it now. But the reason why attacking the Churchill statue is such a extreme culture war event is because it's an attack on that simplified conception of history that must be sustained by the Conservative Party to hang on to that 40% of the vote.
Yeah.
And so if you avoid all of that, let's just avoid all of that and, you know, wrap ourselves in the flag a bit, you're avoiding politics. You're avoiding what fundamentally divides us. Now, I'm not saying that that is completely implausible as an electoral strategy. It's perfectly possible. And in fact, you know, I think, and we probably disagree here, it could work. That you could get, like, the economy's about to tank, unemployment's about to rise, the government is in for real problems. Brexit has only just started to go wrong, it's going to get worse. The Tories will probably ditch Johnson and try and revive themselves under a new leader. Labour might win, okay? They might win. But if they do win, it really matters what they do in power, because if they don't do something about this culture war, they don't actually take positions on this that are progressive, then, you know, there's no hope for the long term, because you can only build an electoral coalition about something real. And so there's a sort of, I think, an avoidance of politics at the moment about Starmer, and that is why I'm off the wagon a little bit with him. I want him to say something. So there we go.
Yeah.
Glad I got that off my chest.
Yeah, right. I feel like that was just important for you, James. I mean, you know, almost irrespective of someone watches this or whatever, it's just you're getting it all out, and I think that matters. I think Starmer is the sort of person who, when you do start getting annoyed by him, you know, he really is quite annoying. He's sort of he's got that quite sort of prefect-y type persona. And I think he's the sort of person who always wants to be seen to be doing the right thing. But unfortunately, what I mean by that is not the morally right thing necessarily, but the sort of he's the sort of person who wants political commentators to be saying, "Oh, you're so sensible, Mr. Starmer. You know, your strategy is so nuanced." And there was a great quote from a particular political professor on Twitter, I won't name, who said, or he said something like, "I wouldn't want to play Keir Starmer at chess." And I thought that's it. Like, that's what he's.
Go on, name him. Who is it? Can you remember?
No, I'm not even sure I can remember. And if I could, I wouldn't say. But it epitomized for me what Starmer is about. And I think it's naive, ironically naive, because as you've, I think, really acutely outlined there, they haven't noticed how politics has shifted. And this is really important. People like Starmer and the political professors who analyze him and the you know, comment writers for major broadsheet newspapers, their political awakening happened in the 1980s and 1990s, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. And so for them, that period was politically formative. The way they understand politics is crystallized by the events of that period. And so 2019 is a redux of 1983. And Starmer is playing the role that Kinnock necessarily had to play to detoxify the left and detoxify Labour and set it on a path for power. And my view is that you know, we won't go into all the parallels and so on. The crucial difference is that in the 1980s and 1990s, a new consensus was being formed and was strengthening, and Labour was having to adapt to it. Post-financial crash, post-Brexit, and now in the COVID crisis, that consensus has fallen apart, and the rules are shifting in terms of what is needed for political to win political power. And what you've said about the culture war is crucial to this. So there is a much stronger sense now of that culture war defining which side you're on, and that being a very kind of emotive, a sense of linked to your very, you know, the sense of who you are as an individual. And I don't think Labour can win people over on that ground. I don't think Labour can outbid the Conservative Party in its its simplistic view of British history, its tub thumping support for the army and the police.
And there's evidence for this, right? I mean, this isn't just a sort of, you know, airy fairy academics speculating, right? If you go back to the 80s, if you go back, say for example, to the 1979 election, you know, and you wanted to know, well, how did people vote? Well, you know, I can tell you off the top of my head, middle class people voted Conservative, working class people voted Labour. We were divided by class, and that just isn't the case anymore. And so, you know, we're just in a completely different political universe where we're now divided by our values, and our values are partly defined by how we think of ourselves. And the young people of our country are hardwired because they're smart, and they've got all this information at their fingertips about issues that they care about, like LGBT equality, racial equality, the environment, that they're much more critical of a really simplistic narrative of who Britain is. And I guess to an extent, maybe they just feel like they're not connected to that particular generation that sort of that lived in that immediate post-war period where you could plausibly engage in a kind of nostalgic vision of World War II. That's sort of receding into the distance now. And so it kind of makes sense when you think about that generation, that they would take a slightly different view. Anyway, I wasn't supposed to interrupt you for that long because you're in the middle of a thought. I was just trying to provide a bit of evidence for what you were saying, which is that, you know, our politics, you know, it's not just idle speculation. Our politics is different, and the data tells us it's different.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on what you said, James. A very helpful interruption. What I would want to do to build on what you've just said is to insert what I think is the kind of the Marxist view of that change that you're describing, because I think actually the really interesting thing about it is there is an economic underpinning to it. We are still economically divided in the 2020s, but those divides are also generational. So there is now much more generational wealth in the kind of boomer generation X and millennials, Zoomers, Generation Z, historically low levels of wealth. The likelihood of being able to buy a house, and the likelihood of being able to find stable, well-paid, secure employment, the cost of your rent, the cost of your student loan repayment, the cost of debt. In all these ways, for young people, life is much harder. And I think, therefore, accepting that kind of rose-tinted view of the country they live in is actually just, more anathema to them. They're much more likely to engage in a kind of critical and skeptical way with politics, because they're not on the kind of, if you go back to the 80s, that, there aren't the same opportunities that there were for people of our age and younger. And so I think those people need a signal that politicians are on their side, just as much as that older generation, stereotyping somewhat, who are much more likely to identify with the kind of traditional values, if you want to use that phrase, that you were just outlining. And I think the thing that I feel gets missed here is that, so to go back to what I said before, I don't think Labour can outbid the Conservative Party on those issues, and in any case, in trying to do so, they're going to alienate the people who currently feel that the system isn't working for them, because a leader who doesn't seem to take their side on those culture war issues isn't going to necessarily inspire them in the way that it needs to happen. So I think Starmer's better option, and also there's another reason why this is true, by the way. So I think Starmer's better option is to make a positive case for the values of that younger generation that we're talking about. And there is a really positive case to be made about the kind of transformation in terms of climate action on racial justice, action on economic justice. That's a unifying thread that can win I think can unite a whole section of the electorate.
And it's a great time to do it, right? It's a great time to do it because COVID, amongst other things,
yes,
has crystallized all of that. Who are the people that are suffering during this crisis? It's ethnic minorities. It's those that are economically marginalized in particular parts of the country.
Sorry, to jump back in again there, those two things go together. So people say, there's a really huge cognitive disconnect. That interview with Priti Patel, I think, where she's asked, okay, well, how do you explain the particularly large numbers of COVID cases in the UK? And Priti Patel says, well, we do have a very high ethnic minority population. You're thinking, well, okay, hang on a second. Vietnam, how many people that we would regard as ethnic minorities live there? What's their COVID outbreak ratio? So why are ethnic minorities disproportionately affected by COVID? Because they're disproportionately living in more crowded, less economically prosperous areas where COVID is more likely to spread. Right. So again, there's an economic underpinning.
I would be able to comment on this, but Priti Patel's blocked me on Twitter. Have you honestly not been blocked by her yet?
I'm amazingly, I think I tend to sort of, I steer clear of Priti Patel's feed. I was talking about this separately with somebody else today and saying, I do think Priti Patel is really one to watch in the Conservative Party. I think we're not going to talk about that now, but I think she taps into a particular, the kind of politics that you've just been describing pretty well. Priti Patel actually does a much better job than probably any other Tory, maybe except Boris Johnson himself.
It's quite amusing when she trends on Twitter, because all I get is somebody commenting on a sort of blank space, and I've just got to sort of imagine what she might have said this time. I'd recommend trying to get blocked, because it's quite an amusing little game you can play with yourself to sort of just imagine what sort of nonsense she's put on a Twitter that my followers are responding to.
Yeah, I do that with Dan Hodges. Guess the sort of outrageous Dan Hodges comment. So that, where does that leave Keir Starmer? I want to come back to that point I was going to make, that other reason why he needs to do this. There is an old-fashioned reason for Keir Starmer to adopt this more kind of positive, clear case for social change and a reckoning with some of these issues in the culture war. And that is because the public do like to see leaders with integrity. They don't like to see leaders who seem flip-floppy and wobbly. And I think particularly going up against, might not be Boris Johnson, but it might well be, let's say it's somebody of the kind of ilk of a Priti Patel. We all disagree. I disagree profoundly with Priti Patel, but we're all very clear about what she stands for. And I think there's a real risk for Keir Starmer I think in this political context where voters are looking to see their leaders choose a side and make the case for that side, rather than this kind of technocratic managerial style of politics that we saw in the sort of Blair Cameron era. That no longer is I think an electorally viable option. So I would like to see him be bolder, project not just this sort of competence, but also this sense, and I don't think he does particularly project that, but anyway, not just seeking to project that competence, but also that sense of a vision, a sense that he's somebody who wants to take people with him, and he's willing to alienate people. I think Joe Biden does show this. I think I think you probably go further on this than I do, but I think leaders of the centre left to show that they are on
just
the
start
side
that thought again, Joe, because you cut out.
Yeah,
start that thought about Joe Biden again.
Sure. So I think let me just gather my thoughts here.
I'm going to have a problem editing this bit now, but there we go.
Yeah, sorry.
Maybe I'll just leave it in.
Yeah, exactly. This is fun. We just glitched.
Joe's internet causes me perennial problems.
I'm up in my bedroom. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway. Joe Biden. Should I? Well,
I think we disagree a little bit on this.
Say that I would go further than you. Well, what I said kind of last week was that, as a thought for something we could talk about, is that I think just looking into the future with the Biden presidency, I think that Joe Biden is going to make Starmer look rubbish because he's going to be actually quite a good president in the mold of FDR and Truman if he gets it right. And even if he isn't, he's talking about the kinds of issues that Starmer needs to talk about in a really confident way. And that's partly because the political context of America is different. America has historically been, even if we own up to our own past, I still think America has been more racially divided as a society than Britain. And therefore,
because we did our racism overseas, James.
Yeah, of course. But I think that's the reason why the Democratic Party, even with a moderate leader like Biden, are more radical than a Labour Party with a moderate leader like Starmer. But it's something that, if you have that global leadership, it's something that can act as it typically does, I think, in the case of American presidents and British prime ministers and leaders of the opposition. It's something that can act as a way of pulling us to the left, maybe, was my hope about Biden.
Yeah, I think Biden has, in his very positive affirmations around trans rights, in his clear signaling about the evidence of the disparities in policing that we saw in the very weak response of the police to the events in Washington, D.C. At the beginning of this month. He has given clear signals. Now, and because we're talking about the culture war, the signals do matter. What worries me about Starmer is partly just he is timid around those signals. And if he's timid on those things, almost irrespective of what his policy is, he's going to struggle to connect with the kind of supporters that I think he needs in order to not just to win X number of voters, but to build a sense of momentum, to build a sense, no pun intended there. I'm sure Starmer probably isn't that keen to see momentum in the Labour Party, but you know what I'm getting at, right? So he needs to have a sense of this is a movement that is driving towards power. That's what Tony Blair had in the 1990s. It wasn't just that the Conservative Party was, deeply divided and tainted by sleaze, although it was those things, but there was also a clear sense of Tony Blair leading this kind of a new Britain towards a kind of brighter future. We talked last time about why I would quibble with some of that in reality, but in terms of campaigning, that was what Blair was able to offer. Starmer is nowhere near that at the moment. If Starmer is aiming for sort of a Tony Blair redux, he is a long way off. And
right, and part of the reason is that and you said earlier, I don't want to go back to 83, but 83 is really important because 83 is when the left splits. You get the emergence of the SDP, the Liberal Party have a resurgence in the alliance with the SDP. And ever since that point, it's been much easier for the right to win elections. I mean, it's always been a lot easier for the right to win elections because the media are always on their side. We can talk about that another time, but that problem of the left vote being split, particularly now, but it's always been a problem. Why is it particularly a problem now? It's particularly a problem now because the right aren't split, right? Because now that they've resolved the issue of Brexit, you have, 43% of the country supporting the Tories because of those culture war issues, and it seems like, it's just not going to go below 40%. And so the only way you have to win an election, if you're not going to make inroads into that Conservative vote, and I think there are good reasons to think Labour really will struggle to eat into that vote unless, what they want to happen is for Nigel Farage to come back, actually, because that would split the right again. That'd be lovely. But if you can't do that, then you've got to try and unite the left, and you can't unite the left quite clearly, I think, by going after Tory voters and not speaking about the kinds of issues that are dividing us in our politics.
So can I jump in on that, James? Because I agree with you almost entirely, but I actually think there is a prize available if Keir Starmer is willing to be as bold as I think he needs to be. I think the primary focus, if I was, ludicrous idea, if I was involved with developing Labour's strategy politically, my primary focus would be on economic change. That's the substance that Labour can offer that is genuinely popular in the country, that, you know, there's no appetite for a return to conservative austerity, you know, that we have historically low interest rates. We've just seen the kind of the importance of like collective action as a means of solving our country's problems. We've got a compelling illustration of it. So there is a really positive economic case for the Labour Party to make, which can win over Tory voters. Now, Starmer's approach on that, and particularly I'm thinking here voters who shifted Labour to Conservative. Starmer's view is that what you do therefore need to do as well is you neutralize the culture war. And the way you do that is essentially, as you said, James, you either don't talk about it at all, or if you do, you do it in very, very nebulous terms, and you use the kind of language of flag and, you know, forces and so on. Now, I mean, if I'm honest, I kind of don't mind if centre-left leaders want to do that, because that's kind of what they're going to do to an extent, right? There's going to be an element of that, which I'm willing to just like overlook. But if there isn't also, this is the crucial thing for me, if there isn't also a sense of despite some of that, you know, more homespun rhetoric, there isn't also a sense of, okay, but also we are clear in our view that there need to be changes in the way history is taught in schools. We need to be really positive in our support for trans rights, and not hedging that in any way, and not having MPs who occasionally retweet things that are, you know, actually transphobic. We need to be really clear about the need for a new settlement on race in 21st century Britain. If you're not doing those things, you're not going to be inspiring the kind of support that can take a positive and popular economic program and turn it into a mass movement. And actually, you're not going to, you know, so there are some Tory voters, Labour Tory switchers, who you're not going to win back. And you doesn't matter whether you play the game of writing articles in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, or you go the other way, you follow my advice. You're just not going to come back. They, you know, actually in some cases for economic reasons, they've, you know, we're talking here.
Well, I think that's crucial actually to understand.
Yeah, people who are culturally working class, but actually, you know,
lots of these areas that shifted in the Red Wall shifted not because of anything other than the fact that they've become more affluent over time, and therefore. The real question was, why didn't they shift sooner? Lots of these areas had, you know, historically not voted Conservative for deep-rooted reasons, and so it just took a little bit more time for them to shift over to the Tories. So there was underlying economic forces, I think, pushing some of those areas in that direction, which makes me think that the other thing that's wrong with the Labour strategy is to think, well, they're the areas we need to win back. I think they need to start to think about electoral geography a little bit differently and think, well, why are we doing so well in London, and can we do that elsewhere? And if we are going to do that elsewhere, what does our target list look like?
Yeah, but also, you know, I just think we don't give enough credibility to, you know, because I think this is where I go back to the 2017 election, that sense of momentum that the Labour Party had during that campaign, that in itself shifts votes. People vote for a party that they think, oh,
well, that's, you know, but that's the problem with the strategy you've just outlined, because you've just said, I'm okay with a leader that sort of, you know, sits on the fence a little bit.
No, don't. Sorry, James, can I clarify that, and then you can make your point?
Yeah.
No, just to be clear, what I mean by that is I expect the leader of the Labour Party to occasionally offer the kind of reassuring signals on, you know, I'm fundamentally a patriotic guy. Right. I believe in British values. You know, stuff that I just think is nebulous and like naff. But you know, you've got to do it. But I don't support sitting on the fence, because I think alongside that there has to be clear statements about marginalised communities and people and, you know, groups who the Labour Party should be on the side of, because that's also part of the reason the Labour Party exists.
I think part of the problem with that approach is that if it is so contentless, I mean, part of what a leader of the opposition needs to do is stand up for a particular idea of Britain. And whatever we happen to think about Tony Blair, and I know many people watching this won't like him very much, Blair was able to do that. He was able to say, look, Britain, you know, a new dawn has broken, has it not? Those weren't empty words. That was Blair saying, look, I believe in Britain. He actually repeats that 3 times. If you look at the party political broadcast from 1997 with the Bulldog that nobody would remember, He says 3 times, "I believe in Britain. Britain
And
can
when
be
he's
great," like that with his thumb. Anyway,
yeah, when he's walking to number 10, you've got
yeah,
the
and
British
it
flag.
wasn't contentless. Now
No.
for Starmer to do better, he needs to lean into, rather than leaning away from, the culture war issues. That's what Jeremy Corbyn did successfully in 2017. We want a Britain for the many, not the few, and we actually mean it. You know, what he can't be is sort of like, I don't know, it's just, and I really want to emphasize those watching, right? I have been Starmer's biggest defender. Not just, you can look back through my social media if you want, but I've just, in the last few days, and it was to do with schools really. He's been terrible on schools. He's put forward this argument. It started at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. We need to vaccinate teachers. Now, Joe and I are both teachers. Now, he's obviously doing this for strategic reasons, because he's certainly not doing it because he believes in supporting the unions, even though it happens to be an NEU position. He must be doing this for strategic reasons. I don't know who's advising him on the strategy, but that must be the reason. But it makes absolutely no sense. For the entire crisis, Starmer has said, look, as a criticism of the government, he said, why aren't you following the science? Yeah. And the one time that the government follows the science, because that's what the scientists are advising, they're saying, well, actually, if we're going to avoid deaths, we need to go in exactly this way and not deviate from it. Otherwise, more people are going to die. On this occasion, Starmer decided, oh, well, let's just forget the science. And for purely political reasons, let's talk about vaccinating teachers, even though the safety of teachers is not the reason why schools are shut. Schools are shut because we need to bring R down below 1 to stop the infection doubling, this exponential growth that's so problematic, that leads to increasing cases, increasing hospitalizations and increasing deaths. And vaccinating teachers does absolutely nothing to stop that. And furthermore, those teachers that are at risk, of which there are some, are going to be vaccinated anyway. And it's certainly not me. I don't need the vaccine. I should be at the back of the list. Right? I'm young.
I got asthma. But yeah, no, I mean,
it drives me mad. And there's no political philosophy underlying this. There's no values underlying this. It's just strategy. And it's like,
yeah,
what do I grab onto, Starmer? Right? I've been really trying to grab onto something here. What do you believe? It shouldn't take. I mean, what would the average? We should do this. We should get a camera out and go around. I mean, Brighton would have an interesting view, and it's the only place we could do this. But if you ask the average person, what does this guy believe, Starmer? What would they say? They'd either not be able to answer it because they've got no idea who he is, which is because most people don't pay attention to politics, or they'd have no idea. Whereas if you say, as you said earlier, Priti Patel, what does she believe? Or Boris Johnson, what does he believe?
I think they might also, worse for Labour, I think they might also be able to quote lines like Captain Hindsight.
Yeah.
It's, one thing that Boris Johnson.
That's the other thing about the vaccine thing, right? And I will stop ranting in a second, but vaccine, if you look at the polling that came out from Opinion today in The Guardian, the delivery of the vaccine is the only thing that British people, no, sorry, it's not quite the only thing, there are a few other things on this, but it's the most prominent thing, and by far and away where, if you ask British people, what have the government got right during this crisis? They say, roll out of the vaccine, right? So just in purely strategic terms, even if you avoid everything else that's wrong with it, to talk about the vaccine at all is terrible strategy, because it's highlighting to people, oh, the vaccine, that's something I think the government's got right. Whereas what's the thing that people think the government have got wrong? Well, timing of lockdowns, the number of people that have died, there's a whole list of things that you could talk about. Where you could highlight some of these things we've been talking about. You could say, well, why have so many people died? It's because of austerity. It's because of inequality. It's because of all of these underlying problems, which must not continue when we get out of this crisis. Because we need a new Britain.
I think there's a good case for the Labour Party sort of avoiding that debate now, actually. I do, to some extent, see the logic of that. I would rather at the moment see Keir Starmer advocating for the kind of positive transformation that he wants to see Britain make out of the crisis, rather than necessarily going for the Tories on the mistakes and worse, actually, the negligence that we've seen over the past 12 months. I think actually in some sense people like Piers Morgan do a better job of that. They're I mean, Piers Morgan is seen as a more kind of neutral, he's obviously not in it. He voted Conservative in 2019. To see him kind of laying into government ministers every morning probably does a better job of just fixing in the public mind that perception. I do think that perception is going to be highly damaging to the Conservative Party. It's just not yet, because actually the crisis is still it's ongoing. And actually, people at this point, I do think part of the Conservative polling being, surprisingly high and actually now having a bit of a bounce with the vaccine, I do think there's a soft element that isn't being recognised yet, which is that people want to support the ship, the captain of the ship, while it's still navigating these very treacherous waters.
Yeah.
I think post-crisis, that's when Labour can really be driving home the message of failure, and that will be backed up by, what I expect will be some form of inquiry process that happens in the aftermath of COVID, although clearly the government will be trying to clip the wings of that as much as it possibly can. So that's one point, right? Is that there's some logic to that policy of not always harping on the government's mistakes, because it can be seen as opportunistic. But the alternative, in my mind, shouldn't be talking up the things the government is doing well. It should be talking up the sense of what Labour is going to offer as an alternative, as a means of taking the country out of the crisis. So that's point one. Point two, around Keir Starmer is just this point. I think I want to just nail this down now, this point about Keir Starmer, the strategist. Let's get one thing clear about Keir Starmer. He's not an experienced politician. He was first elected as an MP in 2015. He was almost, was very quickly promoted to the shadow cabinet. He's clearly, very distinguished lawyer and QC. I'm sure he's got a decent strategic brain. But when it comes to politics, he's relatively inexperienced. And I think that in his was around the issue of school closures at the beginning of this term, so in January. That was clear that the Labour Party should have been advocating for the closure of schools, really from around, in fact, before Christmas. There was a point where actually schools were trying to close in the last week before the Christmas holidays. The government was actually considering legal action. I think it did basically force them to reopen under threat of legal action, which was, clearly deeply misguided, clearly against the scientific advice, and it was never feasible that schools were going to reopen fully at the start of the Lent term in January. But the government was pushing that anyway. And because why did Starmer do that? The reason is very simple, because in the simple model of politics that he understands, one thing the Labour leader cannot do is be seen as being too close to trade unions. And so the NEU position was that schools shouldn't reopen. Starmer was wary of being seen to be kept too closely aligned with that. And the result was that he ended up U-turning at the same pace the government did, which meant he couldn't gain any political capital from that government U-turn, because Boris Johnson sort of got in, this weird sort of bit in PMQs where Boris Johnson effectively had to go at Keir Starmer for basically taking his position, and saying, well, look, it's evidence that you are, Captain Hindsight, even though the government had performed exactly the same U-turning policy, or had performed the U-turning policy on that exact issue. So those weaknesses of strategy are becoming more obvious. And I think, why does Starmer get away with this? You see it a bit with Brexit. People are now kind of falling over themselves to say, Starmer's policy on Brexit is so sensible. He's tacked away from this kind of very pro-Remain position that he had in 2019. He's made clear that Labour accepts Brexit and, will work to, implement it and maintain it for the foreseeable future. The exact same position taken by the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn was pilloried as being like out of touch with Labour supporters and divisive, lacking clarity, too wishy-washy, etc. So that's just a good example of how, we're not going to debate the actual policy itself, but it's a good example of how essentially the same approach being taken by Corbyn and by Starmer gets a very different write-up.
Right, because Starmer's desperate, and this again goes back to the tired cliche of Kinnock, Smith, Blair. We need to do that again, because because one of the things they did is that they neutralized the press, or indeed, in the case of Blair, got the support of the Murdoch press. And so Starmer is trying to do the same. There's nothing wrong, by the way, lots of people criticizing Starmer today. There's nothing wrong with writing for the Daily Mail, but it might matter what you write. I think one thought, and I don't know whether I even believe this, but maybe I do, is that the Labour Party need to be just far more confident about annoying the right-wing press. I mean, one of the things that we maybe should learn from 2017 is that you can have a Labour leader be attacked remorselessly in the press. I mean, for example, there was a Sun headline in the 2017 campaign, which I actually wrote to the press regulator about, and my complaint was not upheld, where the headline was Jez's jihadi comrades. And the story was based upon Jeremy speaking to a massive crowd of like thousands of people, and there were some like nutters at the back of the crowd. That was the story. And the headline in the Sun, like the front page headline, was Jez's jihadi comrades, right? So I obviously wrote to the press regulator and said, well, the story isn't a story, is it? It's just, nonsense. And they didn't uphold my complaint, which shows how much the press can get away with under a regime where they regulate themselves, and it shows why Leveson should have led to serious reform of the press. But the lesson we learn, getting away from my tangent, the lesson we learned from 2017 is that a Labour leader that's actually speaking a message that people are receptive to can cut through all of that by, again, if you look at the 2017 election, there's evidence that the most retweeted tweets and the most prominent things that got through to people on social media were negative things about Theresa May and positive things about Jeremy Corbyn. So you can, if you're willing to ignore the right-wing press, and then you can get your message through. I mean, the downside to that is you're going to get relentlessly attacked, because that's what happens to. There's only one Labour leader I can think of that hasn't suffered from those attacks, and that's Tony Blair. But that's because he delivered a content-free version of, I don't know what you call it. I wouldn't call it socialism. Thatcherism minus.
It was like it was a sort of updated version of Thatcherism, or an adapted version of the Thatcherite consensus to accommodate sort of some of the concerns people had, particularly around public services and the funding for those, and also Tory didn't really make a particularly good job of driving out. So I share your view entirely. Right, one thing that absolutely has to stop. I'm almost tempted to swear at this point, but I'm going to resist, because I don't know if we're going to be doing that on this podcast or not. So,
I don't know if you're allowed to. Are you allowed to swear on YouTube? You probably are.
Oh, I think you can swear on YouTube. But anyway,
Labour has got to
stop. Yeah, Labour has got to stop apologising. It's got to stop this timid, cat doffing, sorry, are we allowed to say something now? And we're terribly sorry about all those other things we did and all those policies we supported in the past, all those awful people that we had in the party. But we're so sorry about it. Would you mind if you just? We've got a couple of things to say about the health service. Would you mind listening? Forget it. You're not going to appeal to people. You're not going to make people feel like, wow, this is a movement I want to be involved in. Stop apologising. Stop this kind of endless introspection about what's electable, what will the right-wing press accept, what does the stereotypical man in the red wall want Labour to say. Forget that. Talk about what your principles are, embody them in your policies and in your in your slogans, in your speeches. Have that boldness, because there are several reasons why this kind of so again, I don't disagree with you, by the way. Yeah, fine, right. Again, it links back to the point.
Let's call it the Ed Miliband strategy, shall we?
Because that's all I'm rejecting.
It was encapsulated in the Ed Stone, and the strategy that we're advocating is: are you a West Wing fan? I don't know if you are. Let Bartlett be Bartlett. Brilliant episode where they basically say, the President Bartlett is constantly having to surrender his principles in order to get things done in the Bartlett administration. And they're talking about, well, what should our strategy be moving forward? And I think it's Josh, he writes on a post-it note, I've got an idea, and he sticks it on the board and he just says, let Bartlett be Bartlett. So unfortunately, we can't have that strategy with Starmer, I don't think, because I just don't think there's anything there. If we said let Starmer be Starmer, I mean, let Miliband be Miliband works, and Joe will know that I'm ridiculously enthusiastic about Ed Miliband, and I think that Starmer should bring him back into the shadow cabinet as Chancellor of the Exchequer, or that he should just take over again, and this time people will bloody vote for him. But that would have, well, maybe it was too early for let Miliband be Miliband. But the problem with that election was that Miliband, like in his heart of hearts, wanted to go there, didn't he? He wanted to be anti-austerity. He wanted to really make an economic argument. We've seen that since. His greatest speech in Parliament was along those lines later down the road. But he couldn't do it. He didn't feel like he could do it, and therefore we get in Miliband's 2015 manifesto, we just get a sort of, we'll do austerity, but we'll do slightly less, and we'll cut immigration as well if that's what you want. It's like, oh dear. I wish I'd bought one at the time, because it's a wonderful, ironic mug, isn't it? The Labour Party having a message on a mug that says, "Let's cut immigration." Oh,
controls on immigration.
That's where we need to not go. That's the whole deal right there. Encapsulating everything we've been saying is that mug with "Let's cut immigration," because it just should be nowhere near the Labour Party ever. And if that's what the Labour Party is going to stand for, like, what is the point of the Labour Party? And I think this it comes back to, I think what's been at the heart of maybe some of our disagreements in the past is how you conceptualize what the Labour Party is and what it's supposed to be. Is it supposed to be a social movement fundamentally and then a party, or is it a party and then a social movement? I think if you understand what the Labour Party historically was, it was a social movement and then a party, and therefore that's critical to understanding how a left Labour Party get back into power. You've got to energise enough people out there, in social movements up and down the country to get behind Labour. I mean, just to give one example, imagine if, and I don't think we're actually that far away from this happening, but imagine if Marcus Rashford openly supported the Labour Party, for example. I mean, Marcus is somebody that tries to be apolitical and tries to couch it in sort of neutral terms, but I'd be surprised if he's not going to vote Labour next time. But imagine if you could get people like that actually saying, I want a Labour government. Right, I'm going to call an end to this, Joe. I know you want to say something else, right? But I think the final word of this podcast should be the mug, the Miliband Let's Stop Immigration mug. And he's desperate to come back in. I'm going to stop here. We'll talk about it next week. Look at how upset he is. I don't think anybody can see.
I need to talk in order to flip it over. I mean, I'm desperate to. All I'll say, I'll just hint the stuff I want to talk about. I'd love to talk about that historical context for the Labour Party, but also that perception that Labour Party is becoming too middle class, too concerned about the interests of the woke, etc. Whereas my view is totally different. Like that to really embody the economic needs of working class people in the 21st century, Labour absolutely has to be woke. It has to be progressive. There is no contradiction in those things. And I think, again, that's something that I don't feel that Starmer has properly understood yet. So
that's why we're the woke warriors, John.
Exactly. That is the vindication of the title. That's a good place to finish, I think. And let's live up to that. So next week, let's push into that in some more.
Let's dig into the culture war next time. Yeah.
I think we've touched on it today, but I think particularly that my sense of, or our sense, I think that the misconception around that culture war and the reason it should be fought is strategic, it's moral, and it's recognizing where we are now in 2021, not where we were back in the 1980s, 1990s.
I think I might try and buy one of those mugs just for ironic purposes.
Have it on the desk
Yeah.
while we're doing the.
Right, there we go. We will see you next week as Joe continues to chunt around about the mug. Bye-bye.